Hey everyone, Farid here from the Rational Farid. Imagine you're looking into the origin stories of two massively influential figures from way back. One founded a major world religion. The other became the father of English sacred poetry. On the surface, couldn't be more different, right? But then, you actually read how they supposedly got their big moment of divine inspiration, and the stories are so incredibly, weirdly, specifically similar. It honestly makes your jaw drop. We're talking about parallels that seem way too close to be just a random accident. Now I know what you might be thinking. Coincidence? Or maybe just common religious ideas floating around. But stick with me, because scholars have dug deep into this, tracing the timelines, dissecting the language, and the connections they're finding point to something far more fascinating than just a simple one-off miracle. We're talking about the nuts and bolts of how these foundational narratives might actually have been built, drawing on ancient templates, shared storytelling blueprints that existed long before either of these guys came along. It's a deep dive into how powerful stories get created and spread, and what it reveals about the human element in claiming divine inspiration. You do not want to miss where this goes. So yeah, the parallels are wild, right? And like I mentioned, I'm not the first person to notice this. Way back, we had academics, guys like Professor Fonsi, and later significantly refined by Professor Scholler, who seriously looked at these two stories side by side. They went deep into the texts, Bede's account of Cædmon in his History of the English Church, and the early Arabic accounts of Muhammad's very first revelation, especially the one recorded by Ibn Ishaq, which is one of the most famous early biographies. And their big takeaway? Their initial thesis was pretty straightforward. They argued that the reason Bede's story of Cædmon was so similar to Muhammad's call narrative, particularly Ibn Ishaq's version, is because Bede's account was somehow, indirectly, influenced by the Arabic one. Basically, they thought the story of Muhammad's revelation got from the Arabian Peninsula all the way to England and shaped Bede's writing of the Cædmon tale. That was their starting point for trying to explain these bizarre similarities. But, as you might guess, connecting an Arabic story from the 7th century Middle East to an English monk writing in Northumbria in the 8th century isn't exactly simple. And that initial idea ran into some pretty big problems almost immediately. Alright, so you've got Fonsi and Scholler saying, hey, these stories are so similar. Bede must have known about Ibn Ishaq's version of Muhammad's call. Seems logical enough at first glance, right? But here's where the first major obstacle pops up, and a big thanks goes to scholars like Stephen Shoemaker for really highlighting this. It's a classic case of the dates just don't line up. Think about Bede, the English monk who wrote down the Cædmon story in his famous book, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. He finished that work in 731 CE, and just 4 years later, in 735 CE, Bede passed away. So whatever influenced his writing had to be known to him by 731 CE, or at the very latest, accessible shortly before his death. Now let's look at Ibn Ishaq. He's the guy credited with compiling one of the most important early biographies of Muhammad, which includes a key version of this first revelation narrative. But get this, Ibn Ishaq was only just starting his scholarly career, really hitting his stride around 733 to 734 CE. His reputation as a major scholar wasn't even well established until about 740 CE, and his big collected work wasn't fully compiled and circulating widely until even later, especially the versions we have today, which were put together under the patronage of the Abbasid Caliph Al-Mansur. So you have Bede finishing his work and dying in the early 730s, while Ibn Ishaq is only just getting started in the early to mid 730s, and his major written work isn't widely available until significantly later. The chronology makes a direct connection from Ibn Ishaq's specific account influencing Bede's story. Well, chronologically impossible. It's a pretty solid punch to the idea of a direct influence from that specific famous Arabic source. But don't worry, the academic world doesn't give up that easily. So we've established that a direct line from Ibn Ishaq's famous written work to Bede in the early 730s just doesn't work chronologically. Scholer, though, brilliant scholar that he was, didn't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. He figured, okay, maybe Ibn Ishaq wasn't the originator of the story, but rather he was writing down and refining an earlier existing account of Muhammad's call. And that earlier version, maybe a less formalized one, somehow traveled from the Arabian Peninsula and influenced Bede way over in England. It's a clever move, right? Instead of Ibn Ishaq, Bede, it becomes earlier Arabic story, Bede, with Ibn Ishaq also drawing from that earlier source. And to his credit, Scholer did some serious source-critical analysis that made this earlier source idea plausible. But here's the problem that even with his refinement wasn't really solved, and Shoemaker points this out clearly. The mechanism, the actual how. How did this earlier Arabic story, from a completely different culture, speaking a different language, across thousands of miles, filled with different religious concepts, how did it get to Northumbria, England, and land in front of Bede in time to make it into his history? It's like saying, okay, I know the electricity got from the power plant to your house, but I have no idea about the wires, the poles, the transformers, nothing about the grid. The connection is asserted, but the entire transmission system is a total mystery. The text calls this mechanism vague. This wasn't just a minor detail. It's a pretty fundamental gap in explaining the connection, and it left the door wide open for other explanations. Like maybe there was a different reason the stories felt so similar, something besides direct influence. Beyond the whole timeline headache, Shoemaker highlighted a second, pretty significant oversight in that initial theory. And that's simply the incredibly obvious influence of the Bible on both of these stories. The argument here is that Von C. and Scholer were so focused on a possible link between the Muhammad story and the Cædmon story, they didn't sufficiently consider that both narratives could just be drawing heavily from an even older, shared source of themes and ideas, the Bible. Think about it. You've got 8th century England, which is becoming Christianized, deeply steeped in biblical texts. And you've got the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, which, contrary to some popular ideas, wasn't isolated. It had established Jewish and Christian communities who knew these scriptures. Biblical narratives, tropes, and archetypes were known in both worlds. So, it seems pretty darn likely, doesn't it, that both storytellers, working in different places but within spheres aware of Abrahamic traditions, would naturally pull from that common well of biblical ideas when crafting a narrative about someone receiving a divine message or gift. It's a plausible alternative explanation for some of the similarities, one that doesn't require a vague, mysterious, ancient Arabic text traveling across continents. But what specific biblical echoes are we talking about? And do they explain all the weird parallels? Let's dig into that. So, if the Bible is a potential common source, what does that look like in the actual stories? Let's jump to probably the single most famous moment in the narrative of Muhammad's first revelation. According to the accounts, including the one by Ibn Ishaq we talked about, Muhammad is in a cave, often described as asleep or in a trance, when an angelic figure appears. Holding a scroll of silk, This figure commands him, famously, read. The Arabic word is ikra, and Muhammad's response? I cannot read. Ma akra. Now listen to this from the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament, written centuries early. In Isaiah chapter 29, verses 10 through 12, it talks about prophets who are in a deep sleep, and a sealed scroll is given to someone with the command to read it. But they say, I cannot read it because it is sealed. Already some strong echoes there, right? But get this. In Isaiah chapter 40, verse 6, there's another passage. A voice says, proclaim. The Hebrew word here is kara. And the response? And I said, what shall I proclaim? Ma ekra? Look at those phrases side by side. Read, I cannot read, versus proclaim, what shall I proclaim? And the words themselves, ikra in Arabic, kara in Hebrew. They sound incredibly similar, and the structure of the exchange, a command to read, proclaim, met with an initial inability or a question about the content, is eerily alike. This isn't just a vague, generic similarity. This looks like a direct echo, a literary trope, perhaps even a modeling of one narrative moment on another, much older one. It strongly suggests that the biblical text was part of the cultural backdrop that influenced how stories about receiving divine messages were told in both contexts. So biblical archetypes like these are definitely in the mix. But the big question remains, do they fully explain all the astonishing parallels we see between the Cædmon story and Muhammad's call? Or is there still something more structural going on? Let's dive into that next. Okay, so maybe that's the simple answer, right? Both storytellers, Bede in England and whoever first crafted the Muhammad call narrative in the Hijaz, they both just knew their Bible, saw these cool moments in Isaiah about scrolls and proclaiming and inability, and borrowed them independently. Shoemaker argues, quite plausibly, that this biblical influence is a totally valid way these stories could be similar without needing any mysterious Arabic text to travel all the way to Northumbria. They both just tapped into that common biblical well. And yeah, that definitely accounts for some of the overlap. The biblical imprint on both texts is strong, no doubt. But and this is where Scholar, responding to Shoemaker, and frankly, the text we're examining puts the emphasis. Just sharing a few biblical motifs like the read-proclaim command or sealed scrolls, that doesn't quite explain everything. The argument is that these shared biblical elements, while real, aren't sufficient on their own to fully explain the entire extent of the parallels. They can account for some common motifs, sure, but they can't solely account for something deeper. Because when you look past the individual motifs and zoom out, you see something else that's arguably even more striking. And that's the shared structure, the actual scaffolding these two seemingly unrelated stories are built on. And that's what biblical archetypes alone don't fully capture. So, let's put the biblical motifs to the side for a moment, not dismissing them, but acknowledging they aren't the whole story. And let's talk about this shared blueprint. This is where it gets really, really interesting. Forget just shared words or the occasional similar character type for a second. Look at the actual structure, the narrative scaffolding, the bone-deep blueprint of how these two stories unfold. First off, they both rely entirely on a dream-come vision to frame the entire call or moment of receiving inspiration. Cædmon's story happens while he's asleep in the stable. Muhammad's happens while he's on retreat in the cave of Hira. Described as a dream or vision, even termed the true dream in the Arabic accounts to emphasize its significance, setting it apart from mere jumbled dreams like those mentioned in the Qur'an, Anbiya 21:5. The core experience happens in this altered state. But here's the kicker, the part that's hardest to explain away. Within that dream frame, both narratives follow almost the exact same three-step command-response sequence. We're talking about a mirror image tripartite symmetry. Let's break it down side by side. Step 1. The command. In Muhammad's story, the visitor commands, read. In Cædmon's story, the visitor commands, sing. Step 2. The response of inability. Muhammad replies, I cannot read. Cædmon replies, I cannot sing, adding that he left the feast specifically because he couldn't sing. Step 3. The query. What command repeated? In Muhammad's story, the command read is repeated. In Cædmon's story, after he says he can't sing, a visitor asks him what he should sing. Step 4. The final command result. The command is given again, specifying the content. Muhammad is told to read in the name of his Lord who created. Cædmon is told to sing about the creation of the world. Step 5. The miraculous ability. After this final command, the hero is suddenly able to do what they couldn't before. Muhammad recites the first verses of the Qur'an. Cædmon sings a hymn, praising God, the Creator. And finally, a smaller but still significant structural parallel. In both narratives, the hero wakes up from this dream vision and can perfectly recall the contents of the revelation or the song and immediately demonstrate their new, miraculous ability. They don't forget it. The gift is permanently conferred. This isn't just borrowing a word or a vague idea. This is the same fundamental narrative architecture, the same sequence of events playing out in almost lockstep. It's like they're using the same underlying codebase, the same narrative DNA. This level of structural parallel is incredibly compelling evidence that there's a deeper connection here than just independent borrowing from Isaiah. So if it's not a direct line from Ibn Ishaq because of the dates, and it's not just borrowing biblical phrases, and the structural similarities are this strong, where do these stories come from? What's the ultimate shared source or template? That's the million-dollar question. The parallels don't stop with the dream sequence itself. Look at what happens immediately after the supposed divine encounter in both stories. In both cases, the person who received the vision and the miraculous gift feels the need to get it validated. They seek external confirmation from someone respected, someone seen as knowledgeable in religious matters. In Muhammad's story, after his experience in the cave, his wife Khadijah is understandably concerned. She quickly takes him to her cousin, a Christian man named Waraka ibn Nawfal, who is described as being knowledgeable in the scriptures, meaning Jewish and Christian texts. And Waraka listens to Muhammad's account, examines the details of the vision, and confirms it. He tells Muhammad that the visitor he saw was an angelic messenger, the very same one, in fact, that visited Moses. Over in England, in Cædmon's story, after he wakes up singing his amazing hymn, he's brought before the authorities at the monastery, specifically the abbess, Saint Hilda, and a group of other learned men. They don't just take his word for it. The text says they examine him. They listen to his story and his newly composed song, basically putting his claim to the test. And their conclusion? After this examination, it seemed clear to them that the Lord had granted him a heavenly grace. See what's happening here? The specific characters are different. Wife, cousin, Christian scholar versus abbess, monks, learned men. But the function is identical. Both narratives include this crucial step where the person who had the vision and received the divine gift needs external, authoritative validation from established religious figures to confirm that their experience was legitimate, not just a crazy dream or worse. This specific narrative beat, the post-vision seeking and receiving of confirmation from religious authorities, is not something that's explicitly present in those Isaiah passages we looked at. It's another piece of the structural puzzle, further suggesting that these two stories are drawing from a much deeper shared narrative template about how a call or divine inspiration story is supposed to go. So, we've got significant structural parallels that go way beyond shared biblical phrases. If it's not direct influence because of the dates, and it's more than just borrowing individual motifs, where does this shared blueprint come from? That's the big question we need to tackle next. With all these striking parallels, especially the ones in the narrative structure that biblical motifs alone don't fully explain, are we forced to conclude that Bede must have somehow gotten his hands on or heard about Muhammad's call story? Perhaps from that hypothetical earlier source Scholler suggested? Does this prove a direct line of influence, despite the timeline issues and the vague mechanism? Well, maybe not necessarily. The text raises a crucial point here. What if the explanation isn't a direct connection between these two specific stories, but something else entirely? What if both the story of Cædmon's call and the Iqra narrative about Muhammad's call are actually pulling from something even older, something different, a shared pool of narrative ideas, a kind of common well of storytelling tropes and archetypes that existed in the ancient world? It's entirely possible, just as possible, that they both independently drew from this older tradition when crafting their respective origin stories. Think of it less like A directly influencing B, and more like C influencing both A and B separately. It adds another layer of complexity, sure, but it might actually fit the evidence better. Because let's be real, stories about otherworldly visitors or divine inspiration aren't exactly rare in the history of world literature. The question is, was there a specific type of story, a popular narrative template in late antiquity, that both the tellers of Muhammad's story and Bede were drawing from? That's the direction we need to explore now. Okay, so what is this common well? The argument put forward by scholars like the one whose work we're drawing from is that this shared substrate, this pool of narrative tropes, is largely late antique hagiography. Hagiography. Fancy word, I know. All it really means are the stories about the lives of saints and holy people. Think biographies of religious heroes. This wasn't some niche genre back then. During late antiquity, that period, roughly from the decline of the Roman Empire through the early Middle Ages, hagiography was a massive, dominant literary genre. It was everywhere, in the Christian East, the Christian West, and it heavily influenced the cultural landscape moving into the early Islamic period. People loved reading or hearing about the lives, miracles, and divine encounters of holy figures. Now, historically, many modern historians have kind of had a rough relationship with hagiography. It's often been seen as unreliable for hard historical facts. As the text quotes scholar Stefanos Ephimiadis, it's been dismissed as the genre of perpetual recycling, recreating itself by reproducing cliches which earned it a reputation for timelessness, anachronism, triviality, and feeble credibility. Basically, seen as repetitive, formulaic, and not serious history. It was a bit of a bête noire among historians, a dreaded subject. But here's the cool part, and why this genre is exactly what we need for this discussion. Its very nature, its propensity for recycling, for constantly using and reusing the same narrative tropes and cliches, is precisely why it's such a powerful source for understanding widespread storytelling patterns. These stories weren't just recording events. They were shaping expectations about what a holy person looks like, how they interact with the divine, and crucially for us, how they receive their calling or special gifts. Hagiography created a kind of narrative template for the lives of holy figures, and it's likely that template, that constellation of expectations, profoundly shaped the stories told about both Cædmon and Muhammad's calls. And when you look at some specific examples from hagiography, you start to see just how deep this influence goes. Well, hagiography basically wrote the rule book, pun intended, for how stories about holy people getting divine hookups were often told. It set a baseline of expectations for things like visions, encounters with angels, receiving authoritative texts from otherworldly sources, and how these experiences could lead to the founding of new communities or traditions. Think about this story from the 4th century about an Egyptian monk named Pachomius, recorded in a work called the Ishaq History by Palladius. The story goes that one time, Pachomius is chilling in his cave, just doing his thing, when an angel appears to him. The angel gives him a bronze tablet with a rule inscribed on it, basically instructions for how monks should live together. And the angel tells him, "Okay, you're living perfectly, but now you need to go out, gather young monks, and rule them by this model I'm giving you." This vision and the rule on the tablet laid the groundwork for the foundation of the first organized monastic communities. Now, compare some of those elements to the Qur'an narrative about Muhammad's call. You have an angel, Gabriel, appearing to the holy person, Muhammad, in a cave, Mount Hira. That angel presents him with something akin to a text, the command to read, which leads to the recitation of the Qur'an. And this experience is understood as inaugurating Muhammad's prophetic mission, the core of a new community of faith, Islam. The text points out that Pachomius's bronze tablet and Gabriel's silk scroll are, in a sense, functional equivalents. They are both texts or discourses received through preternatural visions that serve as the foundation around which a new faith community coalesces. This shows that the fundamental assumption behind the Qur'an narrative, the very possibility that a holy person could see an angel in a dream or vision and receive an authoritative, inspired text that forms the basis of a community, was already a deeply established trope rooted in the hagiographical tradition centuries beforehand. This wasn't some unheard-of narrative device appearing out of nowhere in the 7th century. It was part of the literary air people were breathing in late Antiquity. And while the Pachomius story shows the general template, there's another hagiographical example that gets even more specific with the parallels we've seen. This is where it gets even more specific. The text highlights the story of Romanos the Melodist. He was a Syrian monk who lived around 490 to 556 CE. So predating both Bede and the earliest known accounts of Muhammad's call. He became super famous as one of the greatest composers of Greek hymns, specifically a type called Kantakia. You've probably heard their hymns in some traditional church music, maybe without knowing it. Now, the story of how Romanos got his gift, as told in his hagiographical Vita or life story, has some really striking parallels. One version says that during a night vigil, that's paniekis in Greek, a common all-night prayer practice in the Christian East that actually echoes Muhammad's practice of al-tahanuth, his worshipful night vigils on Mount Hira, al-ta'abbudu al-layaliya dawat al-adad. Anyway, during one of these night vigils, Romanos had a dream. In this dream, the Theotokos, that's the Virgin Mary, appeared to him and gave him a scroll made of paper. She told him to take the scroll and eat it. This detail itself references a biblical archetype, specifically from Ezekiel 3:1-6, where the prophet Ezekiel is told to eat a scroll containing God's words. Romanos supposedly swallowed the paper, immediately woke up, and just like that, he had the gift of composing beautiful hymns. He instantly started singing. Now, a quick but important note on timing. The earliest surviving written versions of Romanos's specific call story are actually quite late, around the 10th century CE. That's after Bede and Ibn Ishaq. But the tradition about Romanos himself and his importance as a hymnographer is much earlier. So, it's highly plausible that the story of how he got his gift circulated orally or in earlier, now lost, written forms long before the 10th century manuscripts we have, making it tantalizing to speculate that this story could have been part of that common pool influencing Bede and the tellers of Muhammad's story. Look at those parallels. A significant figure, a night vision in a dream, receiving something like a scroll or text, and immediately gaining a divine gift related to poetic or musical ability, composing hymns like Cædmon singing or Muhammad's recitation of verses. It has strong echoes of both our main stories. And as the text points out, it's much easier to imagine Bede writing about an English poet gaining hymn writing ability, being influenced by a story about a famous Greek hymnographer gaining his ability, than by a Saracen tale from a faith he knew little about. So Romanos's story looks like a pretty good candidate for a hagiographical template that combines several key elements we see in both the Cædmon and Muhammad call narratives. But is it a perfect match? Not quite. Let's compare Romanos's story directly to the specific structural features we identified earlier and see what fits. And what's still missing? So Romanos hits some similar notes, right? Night vision, receiving something like a text, getting a divine gift related to song or recitation, and the context of the night vigil lines up nicely with Muhammad's practice on Mount Hira. But here's the thing. While Romanos's story is a great example of the kind of narrative tropes circulating in hagiography, it's not a perfect one-to-one template for the exact pattern we see in Muhammad and Cædmon. There are key differences that, at least based on the evidence we have, make it less likely that Romanos's story is the single direct source behind both of the other two. For instance, the specific biblical archetype referenced in Romanos's story is Ezekiel 3:1-6, where the prophet eats a scroll. That's cool, but it's different from the archetypes most strongly echoed in Cædmon's call and the Iqra narrative, which are Isaiah 29:10-12 and 46. Remember that read, I cannot read. Proclaim, what shall I proclaim? Exchange. And crucially, that incredibly specific three-step command-response structure we identified as a major parallel between Muhammad's call and Cædmon's call. The command, the response of inability, the query, repeated command, and then the sudden ability. Guess what? In the versions of Romanos's dream story that survive, that specific tripartite structure is absent. So while Romanos is a strong example of a relevant hagiographical trope, getting a divine gift in a vision mediated by a text, his story, as we know it, doesn't contain all the key ingredients, particularly that unique structural sequence that are shared between Muhammad and Cædmon. This suggests Romanos isn't necessarily the single smoking gun source, but rather, he's another example from that broader pool of hagiographical narratives that shared some of these elements. It shows that the dynamic environment of late antique storytelling was full of these kinds of tropes, but the peculiar constellation of motifs and, more importantly, the precise alignment of their narrative structure in both the Iqra narrative and Cædmon's call, that still strongly points to a significant relationship, however conceived. Even if hagiography provided the building blocks, it doesn't fully explain why these two specific stories ended up so structurally similar. Here's the quick recap of where the evidence seems to point. First, the idea that Bede's story of Cædmon was directly lifted from Ibn Ishaq's famous account of Muhammad's call? Probably not. The dates just don't line up for that specific version to have reached England in time. The timeline is messy. Second, are the similarities just because both stories borrowed some random phrases or vague ideas from the Bible, like that read command? While biblical themes are definitely present in both, that doesn't fully explain the depth of the connection. It doesn't account for the precise, shared narrative structure. Which brings us to the third point. The strongest, most compelling evidence for a relationship lies in that structural scaffolding, the dream-come-vision frame, that uncanny tripartite command-response sequence, and the post-vision external confirmation. That pattern is too specific to be easily dismissed as pure chance. So, where did that shared structure come from? The most plausible explanation, supported by the academic analysis in the text, is that both narratives were drawing from a shared cultural and literary reservoir of storytelling templates. And the prime candidate for that reservoir? The rich, constantly recycled world of late antique hagiography. This genre had already established the playbook, the expected tropes for how stories about holy people receiving visions, texts, and miraculous abilities via supernatural encounters were told. Now, even the text acknowledges that while hagiography facilitated these tropes, the peculiar combination and precise alignment of the elements in the Muhammad and Cædmon stories are still striking and point to a relationship that might go beyond just the broad pool. Perhaps a very specific template, or maybe even a harder-to-trace influence within that hagiographical context. It shows us that these foundational origin stories appear to be built, at least in part, upon existing human traditions of telling tales about encounters with the otherworldly and the gaining of extraordinary abilities. They are products of their time and their narrative environment. The human mind is incredibly good at creating compelling, patterned stories, and sometimes those stories draw from surprising, deeply shared wells of tradition. What do you think about these parallels and the idea of hagiography as a common source? Does seeing this kind of analysis change how you view these narratives? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to keep exploring the historical and human origins of religious ideas and stories, make sure you're subscribed to the Rational Farid.